On a flat, bright morning in Tempe, Arizona, two operators walked the third floor of an empty office building. 41 years old, 3 stories, drop ceilings sagging, carpet tiles curling at the seams. The last tenant, an insurance back office, had walked away 19 months earlier and never came back. The owner, a retired developer, wanted $3.1 million for 68,000 square feet of dead space. 26 months later, that same building was not an office at all. It was 54 occupied apartments, and a national lender appraised it at $9.6 million. The deal pulled every dollar of investor capital back out through a refinance, kept the asset, and started paying cash distributions in its 28th month. In the next 30 minutes, we are going to open this deal. Every entitlement, every line of the capital stack, every construction draw, every mistake. Anatomy of the deal. Here is how this episode is structured. The asset, a 3-story suburban office building, built in 1984, 68,000 gross square feet. Concrete frame, stucco skin, a flat membrane roof, and floor-to-floor heights of 12 feet. It sat on 2.1 acres of land with 190 surface parking spaces. When the operators found it, it had been fully vacant for 19 months, and the broader suburban office market around it was bleeding tenants every single quarter. So the thesis. Office space in this submarket was nearly worthless and getting worse. But apartments in the same submarket were the opposite story. Tempe had a major university, a tight housing supply, and rents on a clean 1-bedroom running around $1,450 a month. The land alone, entitled for residential, was arguably worth close to the entire $3.1 million ask. The operators were not really buying a building. They were buying a concrete frame, a parking field, and the right to ask a city for permission to change what the structure was used for. Why does an office building convert well into apartments and many do not? 3 physical things made this one a candidate. First, the floor plate was relatively narrow, about 64 feet from window line to window line, which means you can run a center corridor and still give almost every unit real exterior windows. Deep floor plates create windowless interior space that nobody wants to rent. Second, the 12-foot floor-to-floor height left room to drop new plumbing and ductwork below the structure and still deliver a comfortable ceiling. Third, the building already had abundant parking, which the city would require for the residential use. The proposed program. 54 units across the 3 floors. 30 studios at roughly 480 square feet, 18 1-bedrooms at roughly 660 square feet, and 6 2-bedrooms at roughly 900 square feet. The unit mix was a deliberate choice, not an accident. An office floor plate divides most efficiently into small units, and a market with a large student and young professional population absorbs studios fast. So the team leaned the building toward studios, the unit type that was both cheapest to build per door and quickest to lease. The target rents, fully renovated and stabilized, were $1,300 for the studios, $1,650 for the 1-bedrooms, and $2,100 for the 2-bedrooms. Blend that across all 54 units, and you get a gross potential rent of about $86,000 a month, just over $1 million a year. But gross potential rent is a ceiling, not a forecast. No building collects every dollar of it. Some units sit vacant between tenants, and some rent never collects at all. So the underwriting haircut that number before a single other assumption gets made. Now the seller. A retired developer in his 70s who had built the office himself in the 80s and held it ever since. He had watched the last tenant leave, watched the leasing market collapse, and concluded he did not have another decade to fix it. He owned the building free and clear, no debt at all. That mattered. A seller with no loan has no bank forcing a timeline, which means he can be patient on price, but is often genuinely tired of the carrying cost, the taxes, the insurance, the empty building utilities. That is a counterparty who will trade a soft price for a clean, certain close. Now, the part of this deal that does not exist in a simple apartment flip: the entitlement. The building was zoned for commercial office use. Apartments are a residential use. You cannot simply gut an office and move tenants in. The city has to approve the change of use, and that approval is never guaranteed. In this case, the parcel sat inside a zoning district that allowed multifamily as what planners call a conditional use, meaning it was potentially permitted but required a public hearing and a formal sign-off. So, the deal had a gate in front of it. Pass the entitlement, and you have a project. Fail it, and you own an empty office building you paid $3.1 million for. Here is how a careful operator handles a gate like this. You do not close on the building and then go ask permission. You tie the building up under contract with a long due diligence period, and you spend that period and your own money chasing the entitlement before a single dollar of the purchase price changes hands. On this deal, the operators negotiated a 150-day inspection period and 2 30-day extensions, with the extension fees credited toward the purchase. That gave them roughly 7 months of controlled time to win the zoning approval while the building still legally belonged to the seller. The entitlement work itself took 5 months and cost about $140,000. All of it spent before closing, all of it at risk. That money paid for a land use attorney, an architect to draw a real conversion site plan, a traffic study, a civil engineer, and a parking analysis. Think about what that means. $140,000 committed to a building the operators did not own on a deal that did not yet exist, with a real chance the city would say no, and that money would simply be gone. That is the defining feature of a conversion. The risk is front-loaded. You spend the scariest dollars first before you have any asset to show for them. The operators also did something that does not show up on any budget line. They walked the project in person to the 2 neighborhood associations nearest the site and to each member of the Planning Commission's district. Converting a dead office into housing is an easy story to tell. It removes an eyesore and adds homes. But you still have to go tell it face to face before the public hearing. A public body almost never approves something its own constituents showed up angry about. You manage that risk by making sure nobody shows up angry. The hearing. The conversion drew no organized opposition. A vacant office turning into housing is rarely something neighbors fight. The commission attached 2 conditions: a landscaping buffer along the western property line and a cap on the leasing office signage. Both were minor, both were budgeted for, and the conditional use permit was approved. Only at that point, entitlement in hand, the building now legally convertible to apartments, did the operators release their earnest money and move toward closing. The gate was passed. Now there was a real deal. Now the money. And a conversion has a more complicated capital stack than a simple flip, because you are funding 2 very different things: buying a building and then building inside it. Let's walk it from the bottom up. Total project cost, the purchase, the closing costs, the entitlement spend, the full conversion budget, the financing costs, and an operating reserve came to approximately $7.85 million. At the bottom of the stack, the senior construction loan funded $4.9 million. Above that sat a mezzanine loan of $800,000, a second, more expensive layer of debt that fills the gap between what the senior lender will give you and what you can raise in equity. Then the equity. The 2 sponsors put in about $430,000 of their own money. And the limited partners, 11 of them on this deal, funded the remaining $1.72 million. The construction loan terms matter. This was not a normal mortgage. It was a draw loan. The lender did not hand over $4.9 million on day 1. The money was released in stages against completed work verified by a third-party inspector before each draw was funded. 3-year term. Interest only, charged only on the balance actually drawn. Rate of roughly 8.75%, floating. A 1.5% origination fee. The loan was also sized two ways at once, and the lender held the project to the tighter of the two. First, a loan-to-cost test. The lender would fund no more than 70% of total project cost. Second, a loan-to-value test against a projected stabilized appraisal. On a conversion, loan-to-cost is usually the binding limit because the cost is real and present, while the future value is still just a forecast on paper. And the lender required the entitlement to be fully in hand before they would close. No zoning approval, no construction loan. A bank will not lend against a use the city has not yet allowed. Why a draw loan? Because on a conversion, the lender is financing a building that does not exist yet. They will not fund finished value up front. They fund cost in stages as you prove the work is real. That changes how an operator manages cash. You are constantly running ahead of the bank, paying contractors, then assembling the paperwork, then waiting for the inspector, then collecting the draw to reimburse yourself. Every draw cycle takes weeks, and a sponsor who cannot float that gap will stall the entire job. The mezzanine loan, $800,000. It carried a 12% rate, much more expensive than the senior debt, and it was secured not by the real estate, but by a pledge of the ownership entity itself. Mezzanine debt is the layer you use when the senior loan stops short of your need and you would rather not sell another 20% of the deal to equity investors. It is costly, but it is cheaper than equity if the deal performs, because the mezzanine lender gets a fixed 12% and walks away, while an equity dollar would have taken a share of all the upside forever. The LP investor terms. An 8% preferred return, the same structure a value-add deal would use. The 11 limited partners receive the first 8% of annual returns on their capital before the sponsors earn a dollar of profit. After that preferred return is satisfied, profit splits 70-30 in favor of the LPs, up to a 17% total return and 50-50 above it. One more detail in the fine print. The preferred return was structured to accrue, not just to pay. During construction, the building earns nothing, so there is no cash to pay an 8% pref. Instead, that unpaid pref piles up and compounds, and the deal owes the LPs the full accrued balance before the sponsors touch the promote. An accruing pref keeps the sponsors honest through the quiet, no-income construction months. And this deal added one more term a simple flip would not have: a return of capital trigger tied to the refinance. The plan was always to refinance and hand the LPs their money back, then keep paying them on a deal where they had little or no cash left in. Why structure it this way? First, the preferred return protects the LPs. They get paid before the sponsors every year. Second, the refinance return of capital is the whole strategic point of the deal. If you can hand investors back all their original money and still keep them as owners, their return on the cash that remains becomes, in theory, almost unbounded. Third, the 17% hurdle before the 50-50 promote sets a high bar. The sponsors only reach their best split if the LPs have already done very well. On this deal, that bar got cleared. Now the construction. Total conversion budget, $3.35 million. That is roughly $49,000 per unit, or about $49 per square foot across the building. It breaks into four major categories. Category 1, the building shell and systems, $1.15 million. This is the work that turns a commercial structure into a residential one, and almost none of it is visible in the finished apartment. An entirely new plumbing system, because an office has bathrooms in a central core, and apartments need a kitchen and a bath in every single unit. All new electrical distribution with a separate metered panel for each apartment. New HVAC, individual heating and cooling for 54 units in place of a few large rooftop office units. Demolition of every interior office wall down to the bare concrete frame. And a full upgrade of the fire and life safety systems, sprinklers, alarms, and rated corridor walls to the residential building code. Category 2, the unit build out itself, $1.46 million across 54 apartments. That is about $27,000 per unit for everything inside the front door. New framing and insulated walls to create the actual rooms, kitchens, cabinets, quartz look counters, a stainless appliance package in every unit. Bathrooms built from nothing. Luxury vinyl plank flooring throughout because it survives student and young professional tenants far better than carpet. Paint, trim, lighting, fixtures, closet systems, and window coverings. 54 times in a coordinated repeating sequence. Category 3. Common areas and amenities, $410,000. A conversion has to feel like a real apartment community, not a recycled office. So the ground floor got a proper residential lobby and a leasing office. The old office break room and a stretch of dead first floor space became a small fitness room and a resident lounge. The corridors on all 3 floors were rebuilt with residential grade finishes, carpet, and lighting. Outside, the operators carved a section of the oversized parking field into a shaded courtyard with seating, desert landscaping, and a small dog run, converting a liability, too much hot asphalt, into an amenity. Category 4, soft costs and contingency, $330,000. Architecture and engineering fees, the building permits and city fees, construction period insurance, and the contingency. The team carried the contingency at 10% of the hard construction cost. On a cosmetic apartment flip, 5% is a defensible number because you can mostly see what you are buying. On a conversion, you are opening up a 40-year-old building, and a 40-year-old building keeps secrets. 10% is the floor, not the cushion. And on this deal, the contingency earned its place. Mid-demolition, the crew found that the existing concrete slabs were not level enough for residential flooring across 2 of the 3 floors. A tolerance an office with raised computer flooring had simply hidden for 40 years. Floor leveling added about $95,000 in 3 weeks to the schedule. It came out of the contingency. That is exactly what the contingency is for. A budget without a real contingency is not a budget. It is a wish. On a conversion, always carry it. Construction ran 14 months from permit to the final certificate of occupancy. On a conversion, you also make a sequencing choice that a ground-up project does not face. Do you finish the whole building before you lease anything, or do you open it floor by floor? The operators chose to phase it. They pushed floors 1 and 2 to completion first, secured a temporary certificate of occupancy for those floors, and began leasing them while the crew was still finishing floor 3 above. That decision pulled rental income forward by almost 4 months. 4 months of cash flow on 36 units instead of a building that earned nothing until the very last apartment was done. On a deal carrying a floating rate construction loan and a 12% mezzanine layer, 4 months of early income is real money. It directly offsets the interest meter. Lease up was fast. The submarket genuinely lacked housing, and a brand new conversion with modern finishes leased ahead of the underwriting schedule. The building hit 60% occupancy within 90 days of opening the first 2 floors and reached 93% stabilized occupancy about 5 months after the final certificate of occupancy. Rents came in close to plan. Studios averaged $1,280 against a $1,300 target. 1 bedrooms hit $1,650 exactly. 2 bedrooms averaged $2,125, slightly ahead. Blended, the building landed within about 1.5% of the underwritten rent. Now the number the whole deal turns on, the stabilized net operating income. Gross potential rent was about $1.03 million a year. Subtract a vacancy and collection loss allowance. The team used 7%, which brings you to effective gross income. Then subtract the full operating expenses, property taxes, reassessed at the new and higher residential use, insurance, utilities, on-site payroll, property management, repairs and maintenance, and a replacement reserve set aside for the roof, the systems, and future turns. All in, operating expenses ran a little under $400,000 a year. Effective gross income minus those expenses leaves a net operating income of approximately $576,000 a year. Hold that number. The entire refinance hangs on it. In commercial real estate, you do not sell or refinance a building. You sell or refinance its net operating income. The building is just where the income happens to live. Now the exit. Except on this deal, the exit is not a sale. It is a refinance. And the difference is the whole point. With the building stabilized at 93% occupancy and a net operating income around $576,000, the operators took it to permanent lenders for a long-term refinance. A stabilized apartment community is a financeable asset, and lenders competed for it. The appraisal is a cap rate calculation. Stabilized net operating income divided by a market capitalization rate. The appraiser applied a 6% cap rate for a newly converted, fully stabilized apartment building in this submarket. $576,000 divided by 0.06 is $9.6 million. That was the appraised value. The permanent loan. The lender financed 70% of that $9.6 million appraised value, a new first mortgage of $6.72 million, roughly 30-year amortization, a fixed rate near 6.5%, a 10-year term, and here is the move. That $6.72 million in fresh permanent debt was used first to completely pay off the $4.9 million construction loan and the $800,000 mezzanine loan. $5.7 million of debt retired. That left just over $1 million of refinance proceeds. Add the cash the stabilized building had already begun generating, and the operators had enough to return a large share of investor capital without selling the asset. Two things to flag, honestly. First, this strategy lives or dies on the cap rate at refinance. If rates had climbed and the appraiser had used a 6 3/4 or 7% cap, the appraised value would have dropped by $800,000 to over $1 million. The loan would have been smaller, and the operators could not have returned all the capital. That risk was real, and they underwrote a more conservative case alongside the base case, a downside model where the cap came in at 7% and the refinance returned only about half the LP capital. The deal still worked in that case. It just worked less well. You never underwrite to the outcome you hope for. You underwrite to the one you could survive. Second, a refinance is debt, not a sale. The building still owes $6.72 million and now carries an amortizing payment. You keep the asset and the future upside, but you also keep the obligation. That is the trade. Now let's walk who got paid what. And the refinance waterfall works differently from a sale. Total equity invested at the start, $2.15 million. $1.72 million from the limited partners, $430,000 from the two sponsors. The net refinance proceeds were about $880,000. On top of that, the building had been throwing off cash since lease-up. Roughly $190,000 of distributable cash flow had accumulated by the time the refinance closed. Combined, that is about $1.07 million available to distribute. Per the waterfall, that money returns LP capital first. So the 11 limited partners received approximately $1.07 million at the refinance. That returned about 62% of their original $1.72 million investment. Not all of it. A strong refinance, not a complete capital out. But here is what their position looks like now. They still own their full share of a $9.6 million apartment building with only about $650,000 of their capital still in the deal. And the building, after its new mortgage payment, generates roughly $195,000 of cash flow a year. That ongoing cash flow, measured against the small amount of capital still invested, is a cash-on-cash return of around 30% a year, and it continues for as long as they hold. And the sponsors. At the refinance, the two sponsors took only a modest distribution. The deal is structured so that the LPs are made substantially whole before the sponsors pull meaningful chips off the table. The real sponsor payday on this deal is not a single closing check. It is a 30% share of the promote on a high-performing asset, paid out year after year, plus their ownership of a building now worth $9.6 million against $5.7 million of original total debt. On a conversion that refinances and holds, the sponsors trade a big one-time number for a durable compounding one. No deal is clean. 3 honest mistakes the team made on this one. Mistake 1. The team budgeted the conversion for the visible risks, plumbing, electrical, framing, but did not test the existing concrete slabs for flatness before closing. The raised office flooring had hidden the problem, and the leveling work cost $95,000 in 3 weeks. On future conversions, this team now cores and laser scans every slab during due diligence before they own the building. Mistake 2. They drew the mezzanine loan at closing alongside the construction loan when they did not need that $800,000 until roughly month 5 of construction. 5 months of unnecessary 12% interest is real avoidable money. On future deals, they will negotiate a delayed draw structure, so the most expensive layer of capital does not start its clock until the day the project actually needs it. Mistake 3. Converting that slice of surplus parking into the courtyard turned out to require its own minor site plan amendment, which the team had not anticipated. It did not sink anything, but it added 6 weeks. The lesson: on a conversion, every change to the site, not just the building, can carry its own permitting path. Map all of it before construction starts. That is the anatomy of a $9.6 million office to apartments conversion. One dead 1980s office building. One zoning approval that had to be won before the deal was even real. 26 months of entitlement, construction, and lease-up. 54 new apartments in a city that needed housing. An 11 investor group with most of their capital handed back and a 30% cash return still running. All from taking a building the market had given up on and changing what it was allowed to be. Future episodes of this channel will go deeper. We will do ground up deals, distressed deals, deals that failed, deals in other markets and other asset classes with other capital stacks. But the structure of every episode will be the same. We open the deal. We show you every number. We name every mistake. Anatomy of the deal. If you want to see real numbers on real deals, subscribe. We are just getting started.